Support for this podcast comes from Smart Recruiters. Are you looking to supercharge your hiring? Meet Winston, Smart Recruiters' AI-powered companion. I've had a demo of Winston. The capabilities are extremely powerful, and it's been crafted to elevate hiring to a whole new level. This AI sidekick goes beyond the usual assistant, handling all the time-consuming admin work so you can focus on connecting with top talent and making better hiring decisions. From screening candidates to scheduling interviews, Winston manages it all with AI precision, keeping the hiring process fast, smart, and effective. Head over to smartrecruiters.com and see how Winston can deliver superhuman results.
There's been more of scientific discovery, more of technical advancement and material progress in your lifetime and mine than in all the ages of history.
Hi there. Welcome to episode 659 of Recruiting Future with me, Matt Alder. With organisations now having to navigate the rapid changes brought about by geopolitical instability, economic uncertainty, the ongoing climate emergency, and a surge in technology, it's clear that different ways of thinking about talent are very much needed. So, how can organisations adapt to this complexity and prepare for a future where the old rules no longer apply? What should they consider when redefining their talent strategies in such a dynamic environment? My guest this week is Graham Abbey, Professor in Practice at the University of Bristol Business School and CEO of Farley Performance. From the importance of understanding the difference between complicated and complex systems to the potential of AI in reconnecting us to our humanity, Graham provides deep insights into creating the conditions for engagement, leadership and performance and building an antifragile organisation. Hi Graham and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks Matt, great to be here.
An absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Please could you introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Graham Abbey, Professor Graham Abbey. Oh, actually, it's a very grand thing to be. I really do two main things. I lead an organisation development consultancy. We do work in there as a culture, teams, leadership, and so on. And also a professor in practice at the University of Bristol Business School, where my focus as Director of Executive Education is really developing the next generation of leaders, for this ever complex and challenging world that we're in.
Absolutely. And obviously it is a very complex and very challenging world. From a sort of a talent perspective, what do you think the sort of the main challenges are or the main drivers of change are for organizations at the moment?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I'm going to start to answer that around, I think it is the complexity and uncertainty itself. I think we are, to use an Americanism, we're on the on-ramp to increasing uncertainty and complexity. I think if we just look back at the last 5 years, be it pandemics, be it geopolitical instability, wars, economic crises, and so on, all of that before, without even mentioning climate and the impact that has. The world is accelerating in its uncertainty and complexity. And I think for talent, to ground that a bit more, I think the challenge for all of us is that what we've known in the past isn't going to be a reliable predictor of what we need to do in the future. So if we think of our entire education systems, our ways of recruiting, ways of individuals deciding what we do or don't do, it's often based on what's gone before. And that's just not going to be a reliable predictor of what's needed going forward.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. So how do you think organizations need to start thinking differently about talent in the context of, this complexity and, for want of a better way of saying it, the old rules not applying anymore?
I think the thinking is it's a great question because I think how we think about things and how we talk about things is a really critical part of what shapes what we do. My PhD was in looking at organizational change, but looking at it from a narrative or storytelling perspective, and what that takes you into is recognizing the way in which we make sense of the world is through positioning what we see in stories, in narratives, we need plot, we need characters, we need drama, we need to make sense of it in all those kind of ways. And therefore how we think about talent, and maybe a bit broader than that, how we think about organization is, it really shapes the way in which we then act. So I think one of the big challenges is to link to this point around complexity is to recognize that organizations are not just very complicated things, they're complex, and there's an important distinction between complicated and complex that I don't think is always appreciated. And there's great work that's done in this space. Dave Snowden would be somebody to reference here, around his Cynefin framework. But I love Mary Albine's story around this, around the distinction between jumbo jets being complicated, but mayonnaise being complex.
Interesting.
So things, and I was an aeronautical engineer originally, so I love an aircraft. I got to bring an aircraft into the conversation somewhere. And I've had the privilege to be on a jumbo jet, on a Boeing 747, whilst it's being built. I got to be out in Seattle and see it, and there are millions of parts that go into this aircraft. It's an incredible phenomenon to see, but it does only go together one way. If you put it together that way, you can take it apart again. And if something's not working, you can take a part out and you can put another part in. And that's what complicated looks like, and I think that is our dominant metaphor. It's a very mechanical metaphor for how we think about organizations. Mayonnaise, on the other hand, you take a couple of ingredients, largely eggs and oil, and you mix them together and something magic happens. Something different emerges. So a third thing emerges, and that emergence is definitionally what a complex system is about. Something that wasn't there before appears, and it is almost as if by magic something appears. And you can't then go back to the things before. You can't find the eggs and the oil in the mayonnaise. You can't find the grapes in the wine. That something has shifted and changed. And I think when we think of many of the things in the talent space that we're looking for, be it engagement, leadership, performance, these are all emergent properties. These are things that come out of the complex interaction of a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, that interaction is getting faster, is getting more uncertain. But that's the first piece around how do we need to think differently. I think we need to think and start to recognize that we are working in complex systems as well as complicated systems.
And how do you think employers are responding to that? Are they understanding that? Are they moving quickly enough? Obviously, lots of talk about things like skills-based organizations. Is that the solution in terms of changing thinking? What's kind of happening in the market at the moment that you're seeing?
I think the risk of what happens when faced with what is quite a fundamental shift is we double down on what we know. Peter Senge in this sort of systems thinking world talks about a systems archetype of shifting the burden, and it's about shifting the burden of something new onto something that we know, and I think there's a risk we've seen that happening. We see people driving for better metrics to measure engagement. Engagement, I think, is a really good example in this space. There is the idea that we can quantify engagement, I think, is conceptually quite tricky. Because again, it's the mayonnaise, right? It's this emergent property that appears out of this complex set of contextual factors in any organization. And the idea that we can then break it down again and measure it, I think is a flawed idea, and risks us giving us something that can be useful. I wouldn't deny there's some use here, but it's probably not what we're looking at things that are probably not quite what we think they are in this sort of space. Again, we start to build a new and different narrative around it. So I think there are some really interesting, the skills-based organization, the sort of the kind of moving away from the reliance on old habits and patterns, like people's qualifications and jobs and what we've done before. The idea that we can look what's gone before as a measure of what's going to be successful, again, is one of the things that in a way we've doubled down on, that we need to release ourselves from here.
Obviously, the other factor here that we've not kind of really addressed yet is technology and the explosion in the acceleration of the development of AI. How does that add to the mix of everything? What's that in terms of, is that another complicating factor? Is it a potential solution?
I mean, I imagine it'll be both of those things. One of the phrases I like is a Gregory Bateson phrase, which is that it's never just that and nothing more. And I think as we talk about each of these issues, of course, it is never just that and nothing more. There's always more. And I think that's one of the ways to think about, if we bring together those skills ideas and AI, if we try to hold more than one idea at a time around this, I think what I notice is becoming important is beginning to recognize the connectivity between everything. And of course, it's that connectivity that leads to this emergence. And it's a deeply human thing to connect and to build relationship and to find ways to see the beauty in things and the joy in things. And again, all of these sort of emergent properties that might come from our interactions. So I think one of the things that we have not given sufficient attention to in our organizational world, because of that machine metaphor we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, is the deep human connection that exists in organization. In many ways, our organizational systems interrupt that, break that down, put us into jobs, put us into processes that measure and dehumanize. Whereas I think what this complex world is requiring of us is to rediscover our humanity, rediscover our connection. And I think an interesting question becomes the degree to which, how we use AI in what we're doing. Can we use AI in a way that enables us to refine our humanity rather than, again, that doubling down phrase, deepening our commitment to a worldview that, is actually has been reducing our humanity, been reducing our connection.
I think that's such an interesting point, because I think a lot of commentary around AI defaults to the robots are taking over, we're losing the human touch and everything, we're sort of heading to this kind of technology dystopia. But what you're saying there is actually we have a technology that allows us in some way to understand some of the complex systems that we have in a way that's not kind of reductive and kind of imposing something on it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and also whether it's a good thing or not a good thing is a bit of a moot point because it's with us and it's not going away anytime soon. So I think a better question is the one I think that you're alluding to there, which is, well, how do we position AI in our, in the context of what we're doing? For me, it's a very significant part of, the conditions that we're creating for, productive, joyful lives in our organizations. So how do we think about it alongside other conditions? So I think that's where if you hold a more complex view rather than just a complicated one, it leads you as a leader or a participant in any context to really give more attention to the wide range of factors that are influencing the context. So how do we think about AI in the context of our relationships? How do we think about AI in the context of the way in which we think about skills in organizations? And people in organizations.
And I suppose from that perspective, the way that organizations sort of need to evolve their thinking, do you think that that is going to sort of fundamentally reshape the talent function in organizations? So, at the moment, these things tend to be sort of very much split into silos: talent acquisition, talent management, learning and development, those kind of things. Is this kind of going to drive a sort of a fundamental change in that way of thinking?
I'm going to say I hope so. To kind of come down on the side of it, it's fascinating. I have an HR background. I got into, in spite of being an engineer, as I said before, I got into human resources. I think it was even called personnel in those days, in the late 80s, when working at what was then called British Aerospace, there was a recognition that big manufacturing sites with large personnel functions were developing specialist HR people. You were a recruiter, you were a trainer, you were a industrial relations person, or whatever. And they created this opportunity for a generalist HR professional, which I stepped into, and it was the start of my HR career. So this idea of integrating specialties into more holistic ways of looking at the world isn't a new thing. It's back to that metaphor again. If we hold that sense that we need to maximize the efficiency of the parts of any system, it leads us to specialize. So, and of course, that deep domain knowledge on particular things is hugely important. And at the same time, we need to be able to hold things more holistically. And I think that could be one of the things that AI helps us positively to disrupt. How do we balance this need for doing and being? I think that might be an interesting. That's something that we use a lot in our work, both at the University of Bristol and also at Farley Performance. This idea that as we think about how we have an impact, it is important around what we know, but it's also important about what we do. How do we bring that together? But it also is important about who we are. How are we being in any situation? And I think there's definitely a need to hold all of these. We do need specialisms. We do need deep know-how, but we have to be able to hold those in a much more integrated picture, a much more holistic set of relationships to the world. And in many ways, that's what developing maturity as individuals is about, how we make our own meaning making more complex, more richer. But that's also how we need to evolve organizations.
So lots of people listening are running talent acquisition functions, going through huge changes at the moment in an attempt to address some of the issues that we're talking about. So I suspect that everyone is either going through some kind of transformation process or is about to in the next sort of weeks and months. What would your advice be to them? What do you think this looks like from a talent acquisition perspective, from a hiring perspective? What should people be thinking about as they're trying to sort of evolve their functions?
It's a great question and a really challenging one because in many ways there's always, and there's always a temptation, a desire here to have the ready answer. And of course, having the ready answer is something that's much more akin to the complicated worldview than it is the complex one, where there really are no ready answers. So there is something fundamental here about the way in which talent functions are thinking about the world, the degree to which we can all begin to embrace more of this complexity and wonder what the hell that might mean in practice. Having said that, that would feel a very dissatisfactory end to our conversation. What do we conclude? We conclude it's all very difficult. So I think, for me, if I look at the work that we do, and one of the questions we keep coming back to then is: so what are the conditions that we want to that we believe create a foundation for the things that we want to emerge: engagement, performance, leadership, etc. And we have a little acronym to help us with that, which is HARD is the acronym, which I guess is slightly an antidote to the idea that this is the soft stuff. But actually, this is where it really happens. And these are about conditions that we find are the outcome of the work that we do, and provide a platform for performance in organizations. So higher purpose. We've done a lot of work, and I know there's a lot in your podcasts around this question of what's the bigger thing that we're connecting to. How do we bring meaning to work? How do we think about why we're doing what we're not doing, not just what we're doing? The A is for agency or autonomy, would be another word in that space. How do we create greater freedom to act for people? Again, that very mechanical mindset. And I go back to my early HR days. I was definitely in this space of creating job descriptions, designing organizations, putting people in boxes, all of that, really reducing, the ability of people to self-organize, to act, to see what's most important in any moment and go after it. But of course, the antidote to that is the R, which is you need to be in relationship to do that. So you don't want to create an environment of lots of autonomous agents running around without there being clear and quality relationships between them. And the final one there is around however good you get at all of those things, you've got to be able to disrupt that. That's the D is for disruptive learning. How do we use what's going on in our environment as a positive catalyst for change? Nassim Taleb talks about the antifragile organization, the idea that the opposite of being fragile, and we saw how fragile some of our supply chains were during COVID, for example, is not a robust system. That's a kind of middle ground. It's an anti-fragile, and you had to invent a word because there isn't one, which is, systems, organizations, people that thrive in uncertainty rather than collapse in uncertainty. So, how do we develop our ability to learn faster than the environment is changing? And that's all. So, if I was in those those talent roles now, I'd be looking at what I'm doing and thinking about, how are we building higher purpose? How are we increasing agency for people? How are we really focusing on the relationships that exist between people and in the context that we're in, and how do I, maximize the amount of learning that can go on in this environment? And I think if you hold those conditions, you probably come up with some quite radically different ways of approaching talent acquisition, talent management, and learning and development.
Absolutely. As a final question for you, what do you think the future looks like? What do you think? How do you think we're going to be talking about talent in 5 years' time? Or how do you hope we're going to be talking about talent in 5 years' time?
I think it's a fascinating question, and I would love to know what the answer to that
is. Me too.
And I think it's an interesting question, and it's a very useful question. It's also potentially a wrong question in the sense that it also has a thread of our current mindset, as it were, in that more predictable world, that complicated world that we've got very good at operating in. The way you operate is to predict what's going to happen in the future, put a plan together to respond to that and execute that now. I think quite fundamentally, the world is changing at too fast a rate to have a decent answer to that question. So the thing that I guess I find myself wondering about is how do we operate now when we can't know what the future will look like in 5 years' time?
Interesting. Graham, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it, Matt. Thank you for having me.
My thanks to Graham. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or via your podcasting app of choice. You can search all the past episodes at recruitingfuture.com. On that site, you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Recruiting Future Feast, and get the inside track on everything that's coming up on the show. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be back next time, and I hope you'll join me.
This is my show.